Shop podcast. Begin transmission.
Okay, if you're like me, then you were never really much of a bass player as opposed to a guitar player who picked up bass now and then to put some bass down on a recording, which has been the case with me up until the last 6 months when I've really started picking up bass and trying to, sharpen my skills in that arena. But the problem is that after 20 plus years of guitar playing, I owned no bass equipment. So not having any equipment, bass head or bass preamp, things like that, I had to think of some other ways to do it. All of my stuff was software stuff in the box in Pro Tools or Reaper or GarageBand. And I started thinking, well, what else can I do outside of the box to process my bass sound when I'm recording? And I decided to try out a little $30 piece of gear that I picked up on a whim one day to help me with some vocal tracks that I was doing that just needed a little bit more oomph, and that would be the Art Tube MP. Now this is hardly a high quality, high class preamp as far as like the Manley Vox boxes and things like that. It's not going to compare to those. This thing costs $30 new off the shelf, whereas those others you can get into thousands upon thousands of dollars for a high quality preamp, and that's not going to be this guy. This was something I picked up just to see how it would sound, and it did improve the sound of the preamps on the Boss BR1600 CD that I was recording on at the time. And it still sounds pretty decent with the preamps built into the PreSonus Fire Studio project that I'm using right now to record this. So it's just a little tube preamp. For a $30 preamp, I'm doubting that the tube really even does very much, but you can see it glowing when it's on through these little vents, and it does get pretty warm. It's got some pretty basic controls on it, and those controls consist of input gain, output gain. Then you've also got a button to add 20 decibels of gain to your signal, a button for phantom power, so if you're using a condenser microphone, you can turn that on and you have your phantom power source right there. You've also got a phase reverse, which, let's say that you're doing some drum work and you're running into one of these guys, you want to flip the phase on something, that you can do that with this. Also, it's got, they call it an OPL, and that's essentially a limiter function built into the Art Tube MP. Now, so this will give you some dynamics control built into a little $30 unit. So what does this have to do with bass? Well, you can use it on pretty much any instrument, really, and I do, and it works really well for some things. One of my favorite things to use this on is to record bass, especially when going direct in. Now, what I'm going to play for you is a sample of a bass that was recorded just direct into the PreSonus Fire Studio project. It doesn't have the tube MP on it. This is just going to be a completely dry sample. Okay, sounds pretty decent. What I'm running that bass into is it's going into the stock Pro Tools compressor just on the bass guitar preset, and then I launched PodFarm, the free version, and pulled up what appears to be an Ampeg amp emulation. That's the only processing that's been done to the bass guitar. But what I've done is I've routed that bass guitar track in Pro Tools to one of the send outputs on the back of the PreSonus Fire Studio project, and we're running that output into a Art Tube MP, and then we've got the output from the Tube MP going into a channel on the PreSonus Fire Studio project. So essentially we're running out of that, capturing the sound of the Tube MP and going back into the PreSonus, back into Pro Tools. You notice that there's no sound yet, so it's because we've got all the inputs set at 0 as far as the input and the output. So to get this set just for a basic setting, we're first going to just turn up the input gain till we start seeing the LED here. If you're watching the video, I'm pointing at the LED below the VU meter, until we start seeing that starting to change color on us as it's doing right now. Then we're just going to back it down a little bit. We don't want it clipping too much. And then we would go over here to the output gain. We just turn that up until we see that meter starting to get up close to the red. We don't want it in the red. For a basic setting, we don't want it in the red. So now, right now I'm hearing a pretty fat, bottom-heavy, saturated bass sound coming through the Arc Tube MP. I mean, it's not a huge improvement on the original sound, but it does sound fuller to me than running directly into the front of the PreSonus Fire Studio project. For the amount of low end that this is bringing out, just that little bit of extra oomph is worth the $30 preamp for me. It's a little touch, but it definitely does help, especially when you're running directly in with no other kind of a preamp that you own. If I owned a bass head, I'd probably go with that instead and just run the line out into the PreSonus, but I don't, so this is what I'm using, and it definitely does add to the weight of the bass guitar. So let's see what else we can do here. If you really push this thing, you can get some pretty gnarly effects on it. So let's talk about how we can push this thing. Let's examine some of the effects parameters built into this first. Let's go to the OPL switch. Remember, this is basically a limiter. As soon as you hit that button, you can really hear those dynamics chop off, and you can hear the compressor just kind of squish it down. A compressor and a limiter both control dynamics, and if you look at the LED on this, it's just in the red, period. Even if I roll back the input switch, it's not going to, the input dial rather, it's not going to have any effect on the fact that that LED is in the red, except for when you get all the way back to nothing. It doesn't take very much at all for it to start getting into clip mode on the LED on the front of this thing when the limiter is on. But I'm not really hearing any audible clipping. That's just the limiter doing its thing as far as I'm able to tell. So let's see how else we can push this thing. We're going to turn off the limiter. Give it a chance to recover. Now that we've got that set back up similarly to how we had it originally, let's explore the gain options on this thing. Let's just peg it, see what happens. We got some gnarly grind to it, some real nice beef to that. If you push the input all the way, you're getting some nice meat to that. And if you push the output all the way up, right now it's completely all the way up, both dials maxed out. Getting some pretty interesting sounding saturation going on there, and I'm digging the way it sounds. Now, bear in mind, if this were after the Line 6 amp modeler in this chain, then this would sound like, in my opinion, like complete garbage. The distortion really needs to be before that preamp in order for it to sound natural, like something you'd hear in a rock or a metal song. Otherwise, you know, it might have its place in some textural stuff, maybe some techno, maybe some, you know, it's kind of ambient in bit crushy, and it could sound interesting in certain contexts. And again, it's all about context, bear that in mind. So speaking of context, let's crank it up. And there at the end you hear we've just got nothing but that nasty distortion, very similar to what you would have on the song Breed from Nirvana. So we've got a lot of different options here just built into this little $30 box. That's why I love this thing. It's $30 and you can really help shape your tones quite a bit using one of these things, especially if you are limited on the things that you already have, you know, in your setup to help get you those tones. It's like for me, for example, I don't have a Hartkey bass amp that I can, you know, run into, or an SWR or anything like that, where I can get that bass tone in that hardware preamp and then run the line out and go directly into the PreSonus. I don't have that, so I just run directly into the PreSonus, and then I get everything edited the way I want it to, and then I run it back out into the Tube MP, and I start shaping my tone here. Once I've got a decent tone from the Tube MP, then I'll pull up the amp modeling on the Line 6 Pod Farm software that I've got, and right now I've only got the free version, but it still works pretty decently to get a decent bass sound. You pull that up and finish crafting your tone from there, or whatever else you might have that you want to run it through. You can run it through after this, but this can help you get some pretty decent distortion tones onto your bass track. So that's one of the reasons why I love this little $30 box. I mean, I got my second one on Craigslist for $15. You can probably get them on eBay for a steal as well. These things are totally worth it for the cheap price you're going to pay for them, and I just love the way that this thing handles electric instruments.
The Metal Shop Podcast and Transmission.